everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Betty's Smart Friends. I'm Betty Wang, your host. Today, we're diving into the heart of what it means to have a good death. Our guest today is Kim Burnett, the founder of Good Death Matters, who began this meaningful work in 2020 after helping both a close friend and her mother navigate their final days. With over 2 decades of experience as an event planner and project manager, she found herself uniquely equipped to handle the logistics of death, from paperwork to memorial planning. This experience led her to become a trained death doula and after loss professional, dedicated to supporting individuals and their loved ones before, during, and after death. Join us as we discuss how creating space to honor life can transform the dying process, bringing comfort and reassurance to those in their final days. We'll explore the importance of end-of-life planning, the role of a death doula, and how to navigate the emotional and practical aspects of death with grace and dignity. Stay tuned for an enlightened conversation that promises to change the way you think about death and dying. Let's get started. Hi, Kim. Welcome to the
Hi.
podcast.
Hi, thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Well, could you start by telling us a little more about your personal journey and what inspired you to start Good Death Matters?
I retired from my career in the nonprofit sector um, in May of 2020, just at the beginning of the pandemic.
Oh, gosh.
And in July of 2020, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, excuse me. And then in the fall of 2020, a good friend of mine was also diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so, even though it was the middle of the pandemic, I began doing caregiving for both of them. And it was one of those things where you know, just felt very comfortable for me to be there. And actually, I remember one day my mom said, the only way a mother can, she said, you're actually pretty good at this.
I didn't expect you to be, but you really
Exactly.
are.
Exactly. It's like, is that a compliment? I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it came, I just realized it was a lot of people aren't very comfortable dealing with sickness and death and taking care of people. And for whatever reason, it came very naturally to me. So I began to take classes and look into it. And right around that time, I think there was an article in the New York Times about death doulas. So that I was like, oh, I could actually get trained in how to do this. So that really became my journey. And then I learned more about, you know, I was curious about all the kind of the paperwork component of after someone dies and the after law segment. And then I discovered another network of professionals that were working on that too. So it was kind of serendipitous, and then worked in hospice and just got more experience. So
And how did your experiences with your friend and your mom, how did that shape your approach?
um,
Because those are very personal, and I'm sure your relationships with your clients become very, very personal. But how does that inform how you care for your clients?
yeah, I think the thing that struck me was um, how much the bureaucracy of death gets in the way of being present. And that, with especially with my friend, um, but also with my mom, being able to take on that bureaucratic component of it, just opened up space for them to be with their loved ones, to just, be able to sit in the sun and, enjoy their day and not worry about, filling out that form or making those arrangements or any of those kinds of things. So that really became a motivation, I mean, and that's kind of how I took the name for my business, is that, I think having a good death matters. And, just as you have a good life, and the last thing you want is to be, frantic, to be kind of overwhelmed. And you want it to, you don't want people to worry, I
Yeah.
mean, like that's the last thing they've got enough on their mind, without having to worry about all these logistics.
Could you explain more about what exactly a death doula does? I mean, I don't know if that everybody's familiar with like how do you get introduced to the family or the person who
Yeah.
has the illness? Like what does that all look like?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different kinds of death doulas. But we're really, at the core, I think, to be an advocate for our clients. So and I think also just, a lot of people, this is their first death. So to have someone
Yeah.
who, they're only going to die once. A birth doula, like there are birth doulas and people have had babies before, but this is often, their first death, or were there for the death of their parents or something. They have some kind of experience, but so some death doulas are very motivated in and provide a lot of support in the spiritual realm. So they are kind of they'll perform at home funerals. They'll do more pre and post kind of spiritual ceremonies. And I would say that I am more in the practical doula kind of comport, where I'm really there to kind of guide someone through the process, um, to help them get ready, to record their wishes, to help them to articulate, kind of their wishes in a way that they haven't thought about before, to be there as support for them and their loved ones at time of their transition, and then afterwards to support their loved ones, helping them with the grief issues and helping them with just, kind of all along the way, the paperwork issues that are involved. Um, and how people find me is really through referrals. So, I work with the Walking Well, who are interested in just getting their estates organized. So it's a kind of an enhancement, you know, it's, when someone meets with their estate attorney, they're doing their, kind of their will and, kind of their, um, uh, their medical power of attorney and all of those kinds of forms. But there's additional things like, not necessarily like maybe an attorney will say, it would be really great if you wrote down who you want to get these various items, or, thoughts about, have you thought about your memorial or whatever. But it's not the primary focus of that work. And so I will spend a lot more time with that, as well as trying to get like, I have a list of, everybody should have these 25 bits of information about you, so, and that includes things like, where is the key to your safe deposit box? And, and some attorneys will do
Where's
that.
the title of your car? People
Exactly.
forget about that one.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All of those kind of things. Uh, so I get, uh, so I'll get referred from estate attorneys and financial planners and tax accountants. Then people with terminal illnesses through their oncology support team, they refer to me. People find me through my website. It's mostly word of mouth. Again, in my business, friends and family might be able to pass on my services, but a lot of times you know, because it is ending in people's death, you don't necessarily get referrals.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, right.
Hmm.
Can you explain how, like, let's say I was diagnosed with, or, my parent was diagnosed with something. Could you walk us through the process of how we'd actually, what that might look like and how that relationship works? Because I'm so glad you brought up the practical side of
Hmm.
death because especially, I think the word death doula or people think it's woo-woo stuff, like it's
Yeah.
very crystals, and not that there's not a place for that, but they don't realize all these practical things that you're addressing. as well as being there to support the family or whoever.
Yeah.
Um, can you tell us how that process sort of works
Yeah.
and a typical, I know that there's everyone's going to be different, but how it might work for somebody who's, let's say, their parents dying or
Hmm.
was diagnosed with something terminal, and
Yeah.
they want somebody to help them through this because it's obviously emotional for the
Mhm.
child
Yeah.
and the parent.
Yeah. So, a lot of times I'll try to make my client be the person who is actually dying, because I'm really there to represent and capture their wishes. So, after doing kind of initial scope, I go through a very takes about an hour kind of questionnaire, and just to really understand, everything they've done, like, do they have a medical power of attorney? Do they have a will? Who is their financial plan? That, kind of that stuff. Have they made arrangements for, if they want a burial or a cremation or any of that, or have they given thought to the memorial? So everything, excuse me, end of life, that I would try to understand. Then I would ask, like, kind of more, you know, do you have a 401k? Do you have a pension? Are you receiving Social Security? Are we, kind of what's the kind of scope of your assets? Kind of what's happening there? What kind of, liabilities do you have in terms, and kind of whose names are on what? So what I'm trying to gather is, do they have social media accounts? And, who has access? Do they have a smartphone? Do they have a computer? Do people have access to that? Just to really understand, what do they have in their name that we can begin to, um, make sure that survivors will have access to? What are the things that they don't need to have that we could actually shut down? Do they have mileage points on airlines? I mean, just everything that's kind of in that scope. And so ahead of time, the things that they haven't done, and I'm very interested, um, to really articulate, help them articulate as much as they can. People will often, I'll say, tell me about the memorial that you want. And they'll say, oh, I don't care. I'll be dead, and I'm
Right.
like, okay, but let me back up and tell you why. The more decisions you make now, the easier it's going to be for your loved ones afterwards, because they're going to be in the grips of grief. And the last thing they want to do is figure out what you would want,
Yes. I mean,
that it's that.
as a practical matter, I've been parts of conversations where they're trying to say, well, I think mom would want this. And it's stressful for them because they want to honor their mother, but you're right, they don't know.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah. Yeah. I
and
mean, and sometimes, I mean, not everybody's in agreement what mom would have wanted,
yes.
right? So
Hmm.
that creates like a whole other level. So getting it down in paper in as much detail. And I mean, I've had families say this to me. It's like, this roadmap is so fabulous because, like, and down to like the flowers they wanted the pallbearers to be wearing, I mean, like, and that was just helpful. People just knew what to do. It was like a guidebook, and so really getting people to do that and thinking about music or whatever, but then also backing up from that, and making all those arrangements, because people will say, oh, I just want to be cremated. And I'm like, okay, well, let's get more specific. But I also think we spend time talking about, like, so if you only had 2 weeks to live, what are the relationships that are important in your life, and how would you want to, what would you want to say in those final 2 weeks? What would you want to do in those final 2 weeks? And people think of, like, oh, I'd want to write a letter, or I'd want to, ask for forgiveness for this or whatever. And, we can help them, I can help them write those letters. But I also find that just by asking that question, they begin to do that work now instead of putting it off, and that's something I do even with the walking well, right? Is to say, if you had, and this is the conscious dying component, if you only had 2 weeks, what are the relationships that matter? And what would you want to say or do with those people? So I have a client right now who I was hired to by their son to actually do oral histories of his parents.
That's so
And
nice.
yeah, they're immigrants and they have a really fascinating life story. And so, but then as part of that process, he said, will you also ask, kind of about the memorial and what they want? And so I did that. But one of the things that came up when I said, what, you know, what's something that's left undone in your life that you would like to do? It came up that, they wanted to spend more time with their children.
Oh,
And so I just got an email from my client saying, I don't know what you said, but my dad and I just went on a trip together for the first time in years, I mean, so it's like just asking that question makes people like, what are you waiting for?
yeah. Well, I imagine it gives you a whole new perspective or a very focused and purposeful life for yourself when you're part of these conversations.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and how does that work with, you know, the all of the other folks that are involved, right? There's possibly hospice and
Mhm.
there's the attorneys and
Yeah.
sometimes a financial planner, there's an accountant. Do you meet with all of them or how does that, I mean, I'm sure it's different for each situation. Is there how do you have you seen it work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's with hospice, I provide non-medical support. So it's mostly that they know that I'm there, I'm part of the team. Um, you know, I let hospice kind of do their thing. After someone dies, hospice will come very quickly and, kind of and then be gone. I mean, that they don't really have, you know, that's not part of their thing. So really being there to smooth over that transition, I find because that can be pretty jolting to families to just be like, wait a minute, where did all that support go? And I think that's one of the big misconceptions about kind of what hospice can and can't do. And hospice is amazing service, but they're also every hospice I've ever interacted with is pretty stretched,
Yeah.
so I'm able to spend more time kind of with that non-medical emotional support than maybe they're able to give. Um, with regards to financial and legal professionals, if someone doesn't have a will, I always try to set up just a complimentary consultation with an attorney to see if that's something that's needed. Um, you know, before we do anything in terms of after someone's passed, we meet with their, financial team and their legal team to just be like, okay, this is what we think is going on. Does this make sense? Is this the right plan of action? Um, so everybody's on the same page. So I think it's more collaborative,
Yeah.
as with everybody, I think.
Like
So
it's going back to, the memorial and burial wishes. Do you actually do the calling for them to set up or do you just put a plan into place for them to say, okay, do you need to call this funeral services home just to get, or is
so
it just kind of a checklist for them?
Yeah. So I mean, it really depends on the client, but I
Yeah.
mean, again, my goal, my purpose is to take as much of that, if you have to call, is to take as much of that away as I can.
Yeah.
So with one client, we went on a site visit together
Yeah.
for her to make that decision. For another client, she wanted to do a donation, a body donation. So I just got the paperwork, we filled it out, and I made all of those arrangements. Um, it just depends on, I kind of, or I provide like, in Colorado, there's a lot of options in terms of body disposition, which is kind of a wonky word, but that is what it is. And so it's just kind of letting people be aware, like, so people aren't aware, that we have water cremation in Colorado, or which
What
is
is
a
that?
so so
Sorry.
so water cremation is a more ecologically friendly way to do cremation, where you are actually the body is put into an alkaline mixture, and basically there's a water residue rather than burning gases, kind of fiery gases. Anyway, um, so there's a company that does that, a couple of places that do that. And so
Interesting.
it's just, yeah. And so like they take the water afterwards and put it in the fields, and, for wildflowers, and families can come a couple of times a year and pick the wildflowers. It's a beautiful alternative. So, but there's other kinds of things that they can do. So, yeah, I mean, I'm more than willing to make the calls. I'm more than willing to set up the site visits. However, they need to be able to make that decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So.
what happens, let's say mom dies,
Mhm.
hos hospice has kind of taken their stuff and you come in. What are you doing that day, or how are you,
Yeah. Yeah.
helping that situation? Because that's an awful
Yeah.
hard day.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the things I wanted to say about the team is
Yeah.
that the there's people who come in at different points along the process, and then you
Yeah.
don't see them again.
Mhm.
And one of the services I say I provide is that I'm with you every step of the way, right? So I'm with you, at the, ahead of, before your death, when you're meeting with lawyers, and maybe there's the hospice team that's there or whatever. I'm with you at the time of transition, which maybe hospice is there, but your lawyer's not there. And I'm with you after your death, when you're back again with the lawyers, but the hospice is not there.
Yeah.
And and there's no, I mean, other than family members, there's nobody who's going to be there for, through that whole thing, to really know your person, your loved one. Um, so, but to your point, in terms of day of, so a client will call, I'll get notified that someone is kind of in their last stages, and hospice normally can call that. And at the time of their transition, if hospice is not there, hospice is called, because they have to be the one to report the death. I mean, assuming they're on hospice, not that isn't always the case. And they call the mortuary. And then hospice will pretty much wrap up you know, their deal, right? They kind of have a responsibility, but then they're gone, and the family is typically there waiting for the mortuary to come to transport the body. And I find that is one of the hardest times, right? Is like your person is in another room, everybody's kind of in shock. It's, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of need for someone to just be making tea, or, when transport comes, I really encourage the family to be in another room, or to take a walk or whatever, because that's it's just kind of a jarring experience to see the person that you've loved be moved out of the house or wherever they are. And then, one of the first things I'll do is try to take any of the medications that were not picked up, arrange for those to be safely and securely disposed of, so those things aren't still in the house. Um, I mean, I think whatever people need to have happen at that point, that they feel comfortable doing, however they want that room to be left, I'm there for them. I'm also trained to support medical aid in dying here in Colorado. So that's also known as death with dignity. So people with terminal diseases, who've been given less than 6 months to live, they can choose to take a prescribed medication to end their life, and I can be an attendant in that. So I can help with the paperwork and the process. and then actually be there to mix the medication. The 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 patient has to take it themselves. That's by law, but I can be there to support that process.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, yeah. So,
That's heavy.
yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So
but
can
it's
you
a
go on vacation?
well,
I
so yeah,
mean,
I mean, I do always in my clauses, I'm like, if I'm available, these are the thing, so
yes.
yes, it is a little bit tricky.
Okay. I'm like, are you just always on call?
No, no, I can't
Yeah,
be always on call. But I mean, I do, for example, I will tell people like these are times that I'm not going to be available. So if I know if somebody is in that situation, I will
sure.
refer to them to someone else who can support them.
Yeah. Well, you and I have talked before, and I love the term that you've used,
Mhm.
the conscious dying planning. You kind of talked about why it's important, but what are some things that people overlook
Yeah.
that maybe they haven't thought about? You've already brought up a lot of good points.
Yeah, yeah. So, I think I talked about, not putting off till tomorrow what could be done today in terms of your loved ones, I mean, I just recently had a friend, who died very suddenly. And it was like, but I just saw them a week ago,
I know.
and you don't know. So it's like you need to be, um, yeah, just living in that moment. And that's part of the conscious dying process is that, you know, um, I think it's, as I said, articulating what you want for your memorial. One of the godsends is people who've actually made a list of who they want to get what, and why.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, that is just, again, it's another roadmap that people don't think about. But, I mean, I had an experience in my own life where my grandmother passed away and, they came up with a process to distribute her jewelry, only to find out like 2 months later that she had made a list but hadn't told anybody about it,
Oh
you know?
gosh, yeah.
And so then my dad was like, should I call back so and so? And so I'm like, no, it's done. It's like, don't do that.
Yeah, that's an awkward
Yeah.
conversation.
But, I mean, and that's the other thing is I guess I'm saying here is, and then when you do make these plans, make sure people know that you have done this, share that information. People think, oh, it's morbid, but, the people need to know, I mean, that you've gone to the trouble to do that. I think the other thing that we spend time with is helping people either doing a legacy project or just talking to them about, you know, what are you most proud of? What do you wish had gone differently? What are the values that guided your life? And whether they turn that into their own obituary that they write for themselves, which again is a great gift to your survivors who are being asked to do that at a height of grief. Um,
That's a good
or
point.
they
Yeah.
just or they just have those points so when they go to write it, they know what mattered to that person. That's another really, really great gift to give to people. And I think it helps people begin to get closure, and begin to let go, to do that kind of life review. Um, but, I mean, I think it's not a bad thing to do at every birthday, I mean, as we are consciously dying, right? Is to take a beat and do a life reflection,
Right.
of somebody just asked me that, like, what are you most proud of in your life? And it was really an interesting thing to think about, like, oh, well, there was this and there was this. And I'm like, yeah, I should write that down.
Yes, it's just so that I remember and relive that. Yeah, no, it's nice.
Mhm.
I mean, I would imagine there's some of us with our families that bringing up these questions are very uncomfortable for not only the adult child, but also for the elderly parent. In my culture, um, you don't talk about death. It's like asking to die, right?
Yeah.
It's a big no-no. So I mean, I would assume that sometimes hiring somebody like yourself might help with that because it takes that emotionality out of it. Um, I mean, have you seen that? What have you noticed?
Yeah, it's it's hard. I mean, again, maybe it's because it's me and it's my family, but I feel like sometimes I'm a huge failure because I can't get my father to do X, Y, and Z. It's like he's like, yeah, 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 that's nice. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things people, because people say, how do I get my parents to start talking about this stuff is to actually talk about what you're doing, and to say, I was talking with a friend and I, just did my will, but then I took the time to, make a list of some of the things that are important to me that I want to make sure to go to, the right people and say, what do you think, have you thought about doing something like that or, or just kind of, thinking about um, telling them why you thought it was important for you to do that and like, and the peace it gave you or whatever. I mean, coming from your own personal experience about any of your planning, um, is a way to open up a conversation with them about it. I mean, I think the thing that is upsetting to me is so many times people don't want to talk, some people don't want to talk about death with their children in part because they think it's like like kids are wanting like, oh, don't worry about it, you'll get the money, or whatever, like that's what
Right.
they think a
I
little
think
bit too
sometimes,
much.
yeah, kids, that's the implication that you want to know,
How much money am I going to
right,
get?
and when, which
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
not the case, where
yeah,
you're trying to
yeah,
come from
yeah,
a place
yeah,
of love. And I've dealt with estate settlement, and it's tough when you don't know the people's wishes,
yeah,
right? Even with the legal document that says this, it it covers kind of a blanket, but it doesn't cover the things that maybe have special meaning to you, or
mhm,
I mean, even to the furniture in your house, like where does
yeah,
that go? It's
yeah.
all these things that I think folks don't think about.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, and even, even if you don't say who can get what, you could specify how you want those decisions to get made. Whether it's a game where, like you've seen these games where people take turns and they have a certain, quote unquote, you know, number of amount of money or whatever that they'd be willing to put down on an item, and it's like you begin to get a sense like, I'm going to put all my chits in for that one chair because I really want that one chair, or it's just like a guidance of from the parents or from the loved ones about how they want those things to be determined.
That's
Just,
fun. I mean, that's
yeah,
a kind of a fun way to do something that's probably pretty painful as
yeah,
well.
yeah. Because then you understand, like, it's not that everybody wants that chair, but there's somebody who really wants that chair,
Yeah.
and it just kind of is another way to think about it. But I was going to say, let's see if I can remember my thought. I think the other thing that I've seen is kind of going back to your, kind of talking about in your culture that even talking about death is bringing it on. I mean, it's the same thing. And, I have friends in Jewish cultures. You don't decorate a baby's room before the baby is born. I mean, I think, that you don't invite death. But I think for children of, you know, second generation immigrants and further down, we're further away from these traditions, so part of the conversation is, I know these things. I'm not familiar. I don't know. And I don't, I really, if you can help me make sure that I'm, doing what you would like per how, you were raised, please please, I need you to tell me because I wasn't brought up in that, as close to that culture as you were, you
Yeah.
know. So, because
I'm going
those
to
things
use
get
that.
lost. What?
Yeah. I said, I'm going to use that.
Yeah, I mean, because they just get lost. I mean, and I
It
mean,
is.
and again, this client that I worked with who asked me to ask about his what his parents wanted. I mean, that was part of the reason was because He's like, I know there's stuff I'm supposed to do, but like, I don't know the details. I need the details. Like, and they were very forthcoming. They're like, oh, no, no, this is how it goes, because they've seen it for their parents. So, yeah.
And so have you seen, how does that seem when parents or one of your clients gets gifted these services? Do you find a lot of buy-in, or is it just, with financial planning, sometimes people want to gift financial plans. And what my colleagues and I have seen is when that happens, they're not as invested in the process.
Yeah.
And the value is not that there's no value, but it's just not as powerful
Yeah.
um, without them seeking out the help. Is
Yeah.
that similar to yours?
Yeah, I think that's really quite wise because I think you know so I mean one of the things I do is I talk to the people you know who are being gifted these services and said, this is what your person wants, and do you think this is what I could do? Is this going to be helpful to you at all, or how do you feel about that? And then just really, I mean it's funny because I just had someone who reached out to me this morning about this, and I said, why don't you let me just talk to this person, for 30 minutes as a consultation and see if there's, before you go and spend your money, to do this, as is let's like see if they actually really think that this could be useful, because nobody wants to do that. I mean, it's just frustrating. Then you're a nag, so.
Well, yeah, and I think it's just part of we want to be of purpose
Yeah.
of use,
Yeah.
right? Not we're not doing our jobs to just make money,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah. I mean, and that's not at all what,
Like I've told people, I'm like, well, if you just want to give something that, yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of other professionals out there that will be happy to take your money
yeah.
for not a lot of work, but
Yeah. And I mean, and I think it's just mostly, I mean, I've had clients who've reached out to me and then, for whatever reason, they aren't ready to go through.
yeah,
And it's like, that's fine. I mean,
yeah.
just, it's also, it's a lot, I mean, and I think, what I've noticed is that there's a tipping point where people are ready, and
Hmm.
that's part of the letting go process. And, well-meaning people will will talk to me about somebody and I'm like, yeah, but they're not at the point where they're ready to let this go. They're still fighting the good fight, you know. So,
And what about, you're an advocate for the client.
mhm.
What about when you see, maybe estranged family members? Is that somewhere where it's good to have this outside perspective that you're involved in? You've talked to the person. Can you, do you feel like sometimes as a sort of outside of the family consultant, that can help smooth some of the maybe the rough spots when it comes to estranged family members?
It's um
It's
yeah, I mean
tricky anyways, but
yeah, it's tricky anyway, but I mean I mean again it's like a mantra. I'm just like so and so wanted this, and I mean I see what you're saying, but I'm here for them.
yeah.
And, I mean, and that, and that client has probably tipped me to some of the issues that might be there. So there are
Hmm.
things that I have done to prepare for, you know, certain situations. But yeah, I mean, the more I know about the family dynamics, the better it is because I can try to come up with ahead of time, kind of thinking about strategies to kind of smooth those things over. But I think it's always good. I mean, people are on better behavior because I'm in the room,
Hmm.
like
I
they
can
don't
imagine that.
necessarily want to, with a stranger, quote unquote.
Right.
So that can help things too.
Yeah.
But it's also good to have somebody who's neutral who can say, I think we should all leave the room and let so and so be, or let's all just be quiet. And, I mean, like if people don't know how to be around someone who's dying too. So it's like talking about, making people very aware that like, the very last sense to go is the sense of hearing, you know.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah. So, I mean, being very mindful of what is happening in the room where the person is transitioning is really important.
That's wow. Yeah, I did not know that. Are there other things that maybe people should know that we haven't talked about today that you'd like to share?
Um, I think like one of the things that I especially say to people after someone's passed is you have time. Like people feel like they have to just start right away and do all this paperwork and deal with the stuff in the house and all, and there is no timeline, you know. Um, they can do it whenever and however they want. And, I mean, other than contacting a couple people like Social Security and, but for the most part, nothing has to happen tomorrow. They don't give themselves enough time.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's also um, really important to remind people that, especially someone dealing with a terminal illness, um, the medical to try to keep coming back to what they want their quality of life to be,
Mhm.
because they can get swept up in the medical treadmill. And at some point you just really have to be like, how do you want to spend your time? I mean, I remember saying this to my mom is like, we know you have a limited amount of time. Do you want to be spending, 80% of that in a doctor's office, And she's
Well,
like, no. And I'm like, well, then we need to come up with some, let's come up with a different scenario. But because it gradually grows and grows and grows. And then before but at some point you have to, and that's where I think having a neutral party outside can help kind of be a disruptor to some of that. Um,
well,
when
because
it's,
I imagine or I've seen where loved ones have said, you must do everything to live for me, right?
right.
And I'm sure that's not uncommon because they don't want to lose a person they love.
Yeah.
But having
Yeah.
a neutral party ask that question and pose
Mm,
that question, I'm
yeah.
sure can be super helpful.
And also to have that person, to have someone say, I hear what you're saying, but she's decided that she's, she doesn't want to do that anymore. She would rather be with you guys,
Yeah.
with the time she has left. And that's hard to hear, but I mean, some ways hearing it from an outsider can be very helpful too. So.
Right. How do you, these are, that's usually I ask at the end, but I mean, I think with everything we've talked about, how do you maintain your own balance and peace? Because this is a lot for a lot, because I would
Yeah,
imagine you don't just take one client
yeah,
a year.
yeah, yeah.
You
No, I mean,
are always, you are surrounded by it.
yeah, I mean, and I will say that I don't have a huge client load because I really, again, want to be there, in a deep way for my clients. But I have rituals, I have kind of boundary rituals that I'm like, I have a, music in my car on the way to a client and then a different kind of music on the way back as a way to get out. You know, I, I do think going back to your very first question, like, of my experience with my friend and my mom, I had an emotional connection there that I don't, I have a professional connection with my clients. So that helps. That kind of creates a little bit of a force field around me where I can be empathetic, but it's not my journey, it's their journey.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's about kind of being clear about boundaries. So, but music helps for me.
And would you consider that a hobby or interest outside of work? I always ask my guests from a retirement perspective. I mean, well, you sounds like you retired and you found another interest to sort of
Hmm.
fill your time, but
Yeah.
that people are happier if they have a passion or an interest that they can do once they leave the workforce. It sounds like you found a different passion and entered the workforce in a different way.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, I think I also my all my clients know that I don't do work on Tuesdays because that's the day I do pottery. So
Oh, that's amazing.
so so I definitely have things like that. I mean, I try to exercise every day. I try to,
Yeah.
um but yeah, I mean, I think that's the cool thing about, kind of being quote unquote retired, but having a second career
Yeah.
is it's completely different than everything I ever did before, but it's still fulfilling, but it's not all consuming, right? I mean, it doesn't, uh, it feeds me. I mean, it really
Yeah.
does. I mean, I really, really believe that, um, we need, one of the best things about being a death doula is when people ask me, "Oh, and what do you do for a living?" And I say, "I'm a death doula." And they're like, "Oh," and we have like an hour-long conversation about death.
They're like, wait, you're not wearing all black, and there's not.
But I mean, but everybody wants
Yeah.
to talk about death. Like, I feel like that's like the thing I don't get paid for is to have conversations with random people in my life about death because they hear what I do and they're like, "Oh God, I wish I knew about you when my mom died," and da 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 da. And because people need to process it. And that's the thing in our culture we just don't do,
Well, it's
which is
so
really
true. I
important.
mean, you're part of the reasons why I decided to start a podcast because I feel like there's so many folks like you who
Mhm.
none of us know about. And if we had known about you earlier, it might have, been a resource
Yeah.
and that could have helped us through through a tough time. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
well, tell us, you've kind of talked about your different services, and it
Mhm.
sounds like they can kind of piece what makes sense for them and their
Mhm.
family.
Mhm.
What's the best way for women to contact you if they're interested, or anyone to contact you if they're interested in your services?
Well, I think probably just going to my website. So it's gooddeathmatters.com. And on that site, you could schedule a free 30-minute consultation with me. There's a calendar right there that you can go in and see when I have availability and just talk about what you need. I'm also on, social media and Instagram, and I have a newsletter that comes out. So, but yeah, that's the best way. And all my contacts, that information is there to get in touch. So
Okay, and I'll put that in the show notes.
yeah,
And then for those folks who aren't in Colorado, how can they find somebody like you
yeah.
in their
There's
area?
so there's the International End of Life Doula
Hmm.
Association, and then there's the National End of Life Doula Association.
Okay.
Um, I would say probably go there. And if it's somebody that is just looking for help kind of with kind of a state closeout, there's the Professionals of of After Loss Services, is another good network. And they really focus on kind of end of, after someone's passed, helping supporting people.
And what kind of accreditations do they have to be a part of? Let's just say that the National Doula.
Yeah.
Um,
So this is a field. I mean, I would look to see that someone's been trained and kind of have
right.
worked in hospice and all of that, but and I think this will change. There's no formal accreditation that has to happen. The International End of Life Doula Association does offer an accreditation, and so that may be a way to look, for that. But I think it's more, reading through the doulas and kind of understanding what their emphasis is, whether it's more, kind of on a spiritual journey or if it's a more pragmatic, kind of this practical doula that I do, that just seems like a good fit. And then interviewing and asking for references, I would say. Um, you know, a good doula will have surviving family members that will be able to, willing to talk to them about them.
Okay, that's good. I mean, I think the fear is that you're letting somebody into something very personal, very that may have to deal with their finances.
Yeah.
And is there
Yeah.
any,
Yeah. I
background
mean,
check? Is there, it's
yeah, I mean, I think you would want to make sure that they had insurance. You want to make sure that they've been, whatever, had a background check done, that's another piece. But yeah, I mean, I think that is, you know, that's a real thing. I mean,
yeah.
and there's no, we're not bonded. We're
Yeah.
not, so yeah.
Well, hopefully they'll just come to you in Colorado then. It sounds like it might
Yeah.
be a diamond in the rough.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I thought I really appreciate all the tips and
Yeah.
really enlightening and really fascinating. And I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot from you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed talking with you too, Betty.